The year was 1878. The promise of a new life awaited Eleanor Sutton as the stagecoach rattled across the rugged terrain of Wyoming Territory. 6 weeks of travel had brought her from Boston to this wild frontier, clutching nothing but a letter, a wedding band, and the hope of marrying a man she had never met. But the Wyoming she arrived at was not the one she had been promised. Instead of a wedding, she found a funeral. Instead of a husband, she found a grave. And instead of turning back east, Eleanor made a decision that would change the course of her life forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This is the story of a woman who journeyed west to become a bride, but became something much more powerful instead: a survivor. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the prairie as the stagecoach rolled into the small settlement of Clearwater Creek. Eleanor Sutton peered through the dusty window, her gloved fingers nervously tracing the crinkled edges of the letter that had brought her all this way. The coach jerked to a halt, and the driver called out her destination. She was the only passenger left. "Clearwater Creek, ma'am," he announced, opening the door. "End of the line." Eleanor stepped down from the coach, her boots touching Wyoming soil for the first time. At 26, she had made the difficult decision to leave behind the familiar comforts of Boston in exchange for the uncertainty of life on the frontier. The economic downturn after the Civil War had left her with few prospects back east, and the advertisement placed by Jacob Miller, promising a life of partnership on a promising cattle ranch, had offered her an escape from spinsterhood. The settlement. Before her was hardly the bustling town Jacob had described in his letters. A handful of wooden buildings lined a single dirt street, their weathered facades testifying to the harsh conditions of frontier life. A trading post, a saloon, what appeared to be a rudimentary hotel, and a small church with a crooked steeple completed the humble tableau. "Mr. Miller was supposed to meet me here," Eleanor said to the stagecoach driver as he unloaded her 2 trunks. "Jacob Miller of Sweetwater Ranch?" The driver paused, hat in hand, his weathered face creased with what appeared to be discomfort. "Ma'am, I think you'd best speak with Sheriff Patterson. His office is right there." He pointed to a small building with a wooden star hanging from its porch. Eleanor felt a twinge of apprehension. "Is something wrong? Just speak with the sheriff, ma'am," the driver repeated, avoiding her eyes as he climbed back onto his perch and flicked the reins, leaving Eleanor alone with her trunks in the middle of the dusty street, with her heart beginning to race. She straightened her travel-worn dress, adjusted her hat, and made her way to the sheriff's office. The small bell above the door announced her arrival as she stepped inside. Sheriff Thomas Patterson was a man in his 50s with salt-and-pepper hair and eyes that had seen their share of frontier justice. He was writing in a ledger when Eleanor entered, but he quickly stood when he saw her. "You must be Miss Sutton," he said, his voice grave. "I've been expecting you." Eleanor felt the floor shift beneath her. "How do you know my name? Where is Mr. Miller?" The sheriff gestured to a chair across from his desk. "Please, sit down, Miss Sutton. I'm afraid I have some difficult news." Eleanor remained standing. "Tell me what's happened." Patterson sighed deeply. "There was an incident 3 days ago, about 15 miles east of town. Jacob Miller and 2 other ranchers were bringing a herd to market when they were ambushed. Wagon Massacre. We believe it was the work of the Blackwell gang." "Massacre?" Eleanor repeated, the word feeling foreign on her tongue. "Are you saying that Mr. Miller is—" "I'm sorry, Miss Sutton. Jacob didn't survive the attack. None of them did. They were found yesterday by a cavalry patrol. We're holding a funeral for all 3 men tomorrow." Eleanor gripped the back of the chair, her knuckles white. The man she had traveled over 2,000 miles to marry, the man whose words had painted pictures of a shared future on the frontier, was dead. She had never even seen his face. "I understand this is a shock," the sheriff continued. "The hotel has a room available. We can arrange passage back east on next week's stage if that's what you wish." Eleanor finally sank into the chair, her mind racing. Return to Boston. To what? She had sold nearly everything she owned to make this journey. Her family home had been claimed by creditors after her father's death, and her position as a school teacher had already been filled. "His ranch," she said suddenly. "What will happen to Sweetwater Ranch?" Sheriff Patterson seemed surprised by the question. "Well, there's no will that we know of. Jacob has no family out here. I reckon the bank will eventually claim it for unpaid loans, or maybe one of the bigger outfits will absorb it. But we were to be married," Eleanor said, pulling Jacob's letter from her reticule. "He sent it to me. Surely that counts for something." The sheriff's expression was sympathetic but doubtful. "Miss Sutton, I understand your predicament. But without a marriage certificate or a will naming you, you have no legal claim to Sweetwater Ranch." Eleanor sat in silence for a long moment. The life she had imagined for herself, a partnership on a growing ranch, children perhaps, a place to belong, had vanished before it had even begun. Yet something within her rebelled at the thought of simply turning back. "I want to see it," she said finally. "Before I decide anything, I want to see Sweetwater Ranch." The sheriff hesitated. "It's a half-day's ride, and it's not safe for a woman. Alone." "Then I'll need an escort," Eleanor replied firmly. "After the funeral tomorrow, I'd like to visit the property that was to be my home." Sheriff Patterson studied her for a moment, then nodded. "I can take you out there the day after tomorrow, but Miss Sutton, I want to be clear. The territory is no place for a woman on her own, especially not with the Blackwell gang still at large." Eleanor stood, smoothing her skirts. "Thank you for your concern, Sheriff. Now, if you could direct me to the hotel, I'd like to rest. It's been a long journey." As Eleanor settled into her sparse hotel room that evening, she unfolded Jacob's letters and read them again by lamplight. His handwriting was neat and deliberate, his words painting a picture of Sweetwater Ranch, with its fertile grazing land, Clear Creek, and the small but sturdy cabin he had built with his own hands. He had written of his dreams for expanding the herd, of the communities forming as more settlers arrived, and of his desire for a partner with whom to share his life. "I am not looking for a housekeeper or a cook," he had written, "but for a woman of intelligence and fortitude who can stand beside me as we build something lasting in this new country." Eleanor had responded to his advertisement because those words had spoken to something deep within her, a yearning for purpose and partnership that transcended the limited roles available to women back east. Now Jacob was gone, but the land remained. The opportunity remained. The next morning, Eleanor attended the funeral for Jacob Miller and the 2 other ranchers who had died in the ambush. The entire settlement turned out, forming a somber procession to the small cemetery on the hill overlooking Clearwater Creek. Eleanor stood apart from the others, a stranger mourning a man she had never met, yet feeling the weight of what might have been. Pastor Williams spoke of the men's courage in carving out lives in the wilderness, of the risks they had taken to build something meaningful. As Eleanor listened, she studied the faces of the townsfolk, weathered men and sturdy women who had also chosen this difficult life. She noticed one woman in particular, somewhere in her 30s, who stood with quiet dignity beside 3 young children. After the service, this woman approached Eleanor. "You must be Jacob's intended," she said. "I'm Sarah Donovan. My husband, Michael, was one of the men who died alongside Jacob." "Eleanor Sutton," she replied, taking Sarah's offered hand. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Donovan." Sarah nodded, her eyes reflecting both grief and steely resolve. "Michael and I came out here 5 years ago. Everyone said I wouldn't last a winter, but here I am." She glanced at her children, who were being watched by an older woman nearby. "And here I'll stay. This is our home now." "You'll continue to run your ranch?" Eleanor asked, surprised. With help, Sarah admitted. My brother-in-law arrived last year, but yes, we'll hold on to what Michael built. He'd want that. She studied Eleanor curiously. What will you do now, Miss Sutton? Eleanor hesitated. I'm not sure. I'm going to see Sweetwater Ranch tomorrow. After that... She let the sentence hang unfinished. Sarah seemed to understand the crossroads Eleanor faced. You know, Jacob spoke highly of you. Said your letters showed a woman of uncommon sense and determination. She paused. This land tests everyone who comes here, Miss Sutton, but it rewards those who persevere. That evening, Eleanor sat alone in the hotel's small dining room, picking at a plate of beans and salt pork while contemplating her future. The sound of spurs announced Sheriff Patterson's arrival as he took a seat across from her. Everything's arranged for tomorrow, he said. We'll leave at first light. Should reach Sweetwater by midday. Eleanor nodded her thanks. Sheriff, can you tell me more about this Blackwell gang, the men who killed Jacob? Patterson's expression darkened. Frank Blackwell and his boys have been terrorizing the territory. For almost 2 years now, they started with stagecoach robberies, then moved on to rustling cattle. This wagon attack is a new level of violence, even for them. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Have there no laws to stop them? Territory's big, Miss Sutton. Too few lawmen spread. Too thin. We've sent word to Fort Laramie for assistance, but until then, he shrugged, folks need to stay vigilant. Early the next morning, Eleanor and Sheriff Patterson set out for Sweetwater Ranch in a small wagon. The journey took them through rolling grasslands, dotted with sagebrush, and the occasional stand of cottonwood trees. As they traveled, Patterson pointed out landmarks and shared stories of the area's settlement over the past decade. Land's good. Out here, he explained. Plenty of water, decent grazing. That's why Jacob chose it. He was one of the first to stake a claim in this particular valley. How large is the ranch? Eleanor asked. 640 acres, standard homestead claim. But he had an agreement with the Robertson outfit to the north to share grazing rights on another 1,000 acres of open range. By midday, they created a small rise, and Patterson reined in the horses. There it is, he said, Sweetwater Ranch. Below them lay a verdant valley cradled between gentle hills. A clear stream, Sweetwater Creek, Eleanor presumed, cut through the center of the property, its banks lined with cottonwoods and willows. Near the creek stood a modest cabin with a small barn and corral nearby. A few cattle grazed in the distance, seemingly untended. It's beautiful, Eleanor whispered, taking in the scene. This was the land Jacob had described so vividly in his letters, the place that was to have been their home. As they approached the cabin, Eleanor noticed the signs of recent abandonment. A water bucket left by the door, chopped wood stacked neatly against the wall, a chair on the small porch positioned to catch the evening sun. She felt a pang of grief for the man who had lived here, whose life had been so abruptly ended. Most of the cattle are probably scattered without Jacob to tend them, Patterson explained as he helped Eleanor down from the wagon. But there should be about 60 heads that bear his brand. The cabin door was unlocked, as was common on the frontier, where travelers often needed shelter in an emergency. Eleanor stepped inside, blinking as her eyes adjusted to the dimness. The interior was simple but well-crafted. A stone fireplace, a sturdy table with 2 chairs, shelves holding a few books and supplies, and through a doorway, a small bedroom, with a hand-built bed frame topped with a straw-filled mattress. What struck Eleanor most was the care evident in every detail. The floor had been swept clean, the dishes washed and stacked on shelves, a bouquet of now-dried wildflowers set in a jar on the table. Jacob Miller had prepared his home for his bride's arrival. She moved to a small desk in the corner and found a leather-bound ledger. Opening it revealed neat columns of figures, cattle counts, expenses, profits from sales. The last entry was dated just 4 days before Jacob's death. The final line read, "Purchased white paint for cabin trim. E arrives next week." "He was doing well," Sheriff Patterson commented, looking over her shoulder at the ledger. "Not rich, but making steady progress." Another few years, and this could have been one of the more prosperous small spreads in the area. Eleanor closed the ledger and turned to face the sheriff. "I want to stay," she said, the words surprising even her as they left her mouth. Patterson's brows shot up. "Miss Sutton, you can't be serious. This is no place for a woman alone." She finished for him. "So you've said. But I am not without resources, Sheriff. I was educated at the Boston Female Seminary. I can read, write, and calculate. I managed my father's household accounts for years before his death. And I am not afraid of hard work. Book learning and housekeeping are a far cry from ranching," Patterson argued. "There's cattle to brand, fences to mend, predators to ward off. Winter comes hard in these parts." "Then I will hire help," Eleanor replied firmly. "Jacob's ledger shows he employed a ranch hand seasonally. I can do the same." Sheriff Patterson shook his head in exasperation. "Even if you could manage it, which I doubt, you have no legal claim to this property, Miss Sutton. As I explained before, as Jacob Miller's intended bride, I am claiming this homestead under the provisions of the Homestead Act continuation rights." Eleanor interrupted. "I've studied the law, Sheriff. If a homesteader dies before proving up their claim, their widow or heirs may continue to work the land and fulfill the requirements." Patterson stared at her. "You're not his widow, Miss Sutton." "In the eyes of the law, perhaps not, but in the eyes of God, and by the intent clearly stated in his letters, I was to be his wife. I traveled 2,000 miles based on that promise." Eleanor held up her hand, on which she now wore the simple gold band she had found among Jacob's possessions. "I've made my decision, Sheriff Patterson. I will remain at Sweetwater Ranch and fulfill Jacob Miller's homestead claim." The sheriff studied her for a long moment, his expression a mixture of disbelief and reluctant admiration. "You'll need help," he said finally, "and legal advice, and a good rifle." Eleanor felt a surge of hope. "Then you won't oppose me?" Patterson sighed deeply. "It's not my place to tell folks what to do with their lives, Miss Sutton. God knows we need more settled people in the territory, not fewer. But mark my words, this won't be easy." "Few worthwhile things are, Sheriff," Eleanor replied, looking around at the cabin that would now be her home. "Few worthwhile things are." As Sheriff Patterson prepared to leave, promising to return in a few days with supplies, Eleanor stepped onto the porch of the cabin. From this vantage point, she could see across the valley that might now become hers. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, casting golden light across the grasslands and catching in the ripples of Sweetwater Creek. This was not the future she had imagined when she boarded the train in Boston 6 weeks ago. She had come west to be a wife, but fate had decreed she would be something else entirely, a woman claiming her own place in this vast and unforgiving land. The path ahead would be difficult, perhaps impossible. But as Eleanor watched the wind move through the grass like waves on an endless prairie sea, she felt something settling within her, a determination as solid and enduring as the mountains. On the horizon, tomorrow will bring its own challenges. For tonight, Eleanor Sutton, mail-order bride no more, would sleep beneath the roof of the home she intended to make her own. The first light of dawn found Eleanor already awake, having spent a restless night in Jacob Miller's bed. She had slept in her clothes, unable to bring herself to unpack her trunks that Sheriff Patterson had helped bring inside before his departure. The reality of her situation weighed on her. Alone on a remote ranch, surrounded by wilderness, with only the vaguest notion of how to proceed, Eleanor splashed cold water on her face from the basin and stepped outside. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of sage and dew-dampened earth. A chorus of birds called from the cottonwoods. Along the creek, in the corral, Jacob's horse, a sturdy chestnut gelding, nickered softly at the sight of her. "I suppose you're hungry," Eleanor said, approaching the fence cautiously. The horse trotted over, its eyes curious but not unfriendly. She had ridden in Boston's parks occasionally, but had never cared for a horse herself. Finding the feed bin in the small stable took only moments. She awkwardly measured out what seemed a reasonable portion and filled the water trough from the nearby pump. The gelding, whose name, according to a bridle hanging on the wall, was Rusty, seemed satisfied with her efforts. Eleanor returned to the cabin and surveyed the pantry. Jacob had stocked it well. Sacks of beans and flour, jars of preserved fruits and vegetables, coffee, sugar, and salted meat. She would not starve immediately, at least. After a simple breakfast of coffee and biscuits she found wrapped in a cloth, Eleanor took stock of her situation. According to the ledger, Jacob employed a young man named Daniel Tucker during the busier seasons. His usual arrival date was noted as early May, just 2 weeks away. If she could manage until then, she might convince Daniel to stay on under her employment. Eleanor spent the morning exploring the immediate surroundings of the cabin. She found the well-tended vegetable garden Jacob had mentioned in his letters, now showing the first green shoots of spring plantings. The barn contained a small wagon, tools, tack for the horses, and various implements whose purposes she could only guess at. Against one wall stood a rifle and shotgun, along with boxes of ammunition. By midday, Eleanor had compiled a list of immediate concerns. She needed to learn to ride properly if she was to manage the ranch. She needed to account for all the cattle and ensure they remained on Sweetwater land. And she needed to establish her legal claim to the property before someone else tried to seize it. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted her planning. Eleanor quickly retrieved the shotgun from the barn, awkwardly checking that it was loaded as she had seen men do. She stood on the porch, the weapon held stiffly in her hands as 2 riders approached from the northern ridge. As they drew closer, Eleanor could make out a man and woman, both dressed in the practical clothing of ranchers. The woman, noticing Eleanor's defensive posture, raised a hand in greeting. "Hello there. We're neighbors, the Robertsons. Don't shoot." Eleanor lowered the shotgun slightly but maintained her vigilance. "Please state your business." The riders halted a respectful distance from the cabin. The woman, somewhere in her 40s with streaks of grey in her dark hair, spoke again. "I'm Martha Robertson, and this is my son William. Our ranch borders Sweetwater. To the north. We heard about Jacob, and then the sheriff told us his mail-order bride had arrived anyway." Her frank gaze took in Eleanor's city clothes and the awkward way she held the shotgun. "Said you were planning to stay." Eleanor straightened her spine. "That's correct. I'm Eleanor Sutton, and I intend to maintain Sweetwater Ranch in Mr. Miller's absence." William Robertson, a broad-shouldered young man of perhaps 20, exchanged a glance with his mother. "Ma'am, with all due respect, running a cattle operation isn't something you just decide to do. It takes years of experience." "I'm aware of the challenges, Mr. Robertson. I'm also aware that I have much to learn. However, I am not without resources or determination." Martha dismounted, handing her reins to her son. "May I come in, Miss Sutton? I think we have matters to discuss." Eleanor hesitated, then nodded, lowering the shotgun completely. "Please do. Would you care for coffee?" Inside the cabin, Martha Robertson settled at the table while Eleanor busied herself with the coffee pot. William remained outside, tending to the horses. "Jacob was a good neighbor," Martha said, removing her gloves. "He and my late husband had an arrangement, shared grazing rights on the upper meadow and mutual assistance during roundup and branding." "Yes, I found mention of the agreement in his ledger," Eleanor replied, setting 2 cups on the table. Martha studied her thoughtfully. Sheriff Patterson says you're claiming continuation rights on the homestead. That won't be easy to prove without a marriage certificate. Nevertheless, it is my intention to try. Even if you succeed legally, Miss Sutton, this life—" Martha gestured toward the window, encompassing the wilderness beyond. "It breaks many men, let alone women on their own. My husband and I came out here 15 years ago with William, just a boy. When Thomas died of pneumonia 4 winters back, I had William to rely on, and even then, we nearly lost everything." Eleanor poured the coffee, considering her response carefully. "Mrs. Robertson, I appreciate your concern, truly, but returning east is not an option for me. I've invested everything in coming here. There are other possibilities. The mercantile owner in Clearwater Creek is a widower, or you could teach at the settlement school that's forming. With respect, I did not travel 2,000 miles to marry the first available man or to teach in a frontier schoolhouse," Eleanor replied firmly. "Jacob Miller and I corresponded for 8 months. He sought a partner, not merely a wife. I believe I can honor that intention by continuing what he started here." Martha sipped her coffee, her weathered face impassive. "And how exactly do you plan to manage 60 heads of cattle, Miss Sutton? Can you ride, brand, shoot straight, mend fences, drive off rustlers and wolves?" "Not yet," Eleanor admitted. "But I can learn. Jacob's ledger mentions a hand he employed seasonally, Daniel Tucker. I hope to retain his services. Daniel's a good worker, but he's just a boy, barely 18, and he won't be enough during the busy seasons." Martha set down her cup. "Miss Sutton, Eleanor, I admire your spirit, but this isn't Boston. Nature doesn't care about determination or good intentions. Out here, a mistake can cost your life." "Then I shall have to avoid mistakes," Eleanor replied. "Mrs. Robertson, I understand I'm asking for a leap of faith, but I am not entirely unprepared. I managed my father's household and his accounts after my mother died. I can learn what I need to know." Martha Robertson studied her for a long moment, then sighed. "Well, you've certainly got grit, I'll give you that." She stood and moved to the window, looking out at her son, who was examining the corral fence. "William and I came to offer help with Jacob's cattle. They've started to scatter since the attack. Without attention, you'll lose half the herd by month's end." "I would be most grateful for your assistance," Eleanor said, relief evident in her voice. "It's not charity," Martha clarified. "It's honoring our agreement with Jacob. But understand this, if you're going to make it here, you need to learn. And quickly. William can show you the basics of riding properly and handling that shotgun, so you don't blow your own foot off." Eleanor felt a spark of hope. "You'll help me then?" "We'll help you get started," Martha corrected. "The rest will be up to you." She turned back from the window. "First thing tomorrow, we'll round up as many of Jacob's cattle as we can find. Be ready at dawn, wearing something practical if you have it. Those city skirts won't last a day on horseback." After the Robertsons departed, Eleanor opened her trunks for the first time since arriving. Among her Boston clothes were a few simpler dresses intended for ranch life, though none designed for riding astride. With careful consideration, she selected a sturdy brown dress with the fewest embellishments and set about modifying it, removing the bustle and cutting away excess fabric to allow for movement. That evening, she returned to Jacob's desk and opened his ledger again, studying the neat columns of figures with greater attention. She noted the rhythms of ranch life recorded there, the spring calving, summer grazing, fall roundup, and winter feeding. Jacob had been methodical in his documentation, which gave Eleanor both guidance and comfort. Here was a template for the year ahead, if she could follow it. In the desk drawer she found a bundle of her own letters to Jacob, tied with string, and apparently read many times, judging by their worn edges. The sight of them brought unexpected tears. She had written to him of her hopes for their partnership, her willingness to embrace frontier life, her desire to help build something meaningful. Those words now seemed prophetic in a way she hadn't intended. Dawn arrived with a knock at the cabin door. Eleanor, already dressed in her modified clothing with her hair tightly braided and pinned, opened it to find William Robertson holding the reins of 3 horses, his own, his mother's, and Rusty. "Ma sent me ahead," he explained, his expression suggesting he still had doubts about this endeavor. "Said to get you comfortable on Rusty before we head out to the north pasture." Eleanor nodded, stepping outside with the wide-brimmed hat she'd found hanging by the door. "I've ridden before, but only side saddle in the city." William's skepticism was evident as he adjusted Rusty's saddle and shortened the stirrups to accommodate her height. "Riding side saddle and riding ranch are different as night and day, Miss Sutton. Rusty here's steady, but you'll need to show him who's in charge." The next hour proved humbling as Eleanor struggled to master the basics of Western riding. She fell twice, earning bruises that she stoically ignored, and finally managed to maintain her seat as Rusty trotted around the corral. William, despite his initial doubt, proved a patient teacher. "That'll have to do for now," he said finally, as his mother rode up accompanied by a young man on a dappled grey horse. "This here's Daniel Tucker," William introduced. "Ma found him in town." Daniel Tucker tipped his hat, revealing a freckled face that made him look even younger than his 18 years. "Miss Sutton," he greeted her, his expression curious but respectful. "Sheriff Patterson said you're taking over for Mr. Miller. I'm mighty sorry about what happened to him." "Thank you, Daniel. I was hoping you'd be willing to work for me as you did for Mr. Miller." "I'll match his wages," the young man nodded. "Yes, ma'am. Mr. Miller was good to me, taught me a lot." Martha Robertson joined them, eyeing Eleanor's modified dress with approval. "Might want to consider trousers eventually," she advised pragmatically, "but that'll do for today. We've got work ahead." The day that followed tested Eleanor beyond anything she had experienced in her sheltered Boston life. They rode for miles, across Sweetwater land, gathering scattered cattle with Daniel and the Robertsons doing most of the actual herding, while Eleanor struggled to keep up and observe their techniques. By midday, they had located nearly 40 head bearing Jacob's brand, a simple SM for Sweetwater Miller. "There's still a good 20 heads unaccounted for," Martha noted as they paused to eat the simple lunch she had packed. "Likely drifted west toward Coyote Canyon. We'll head there next." Eleanor's muscles screamed in protest as she remounted Rusty, but she said nothing, determined to continue despite the discomfort. William, riding alongside her as they headed toward the canyon, finally broke his reserved demeanor. "You're tougher than you look, Miss Sutton," he observed. "Most city folk would have quit hours ago." "I'm no longer a city person, Mr. Robertson," Eleanor replied, adjusting her hat against the afternoon sun, "and I cannot afford to quit." They found the remaining cattle in a sheltered area of the canyon, apparently driven there by instinct after the loss of their regular caretaker. As they began the slow process of driving them back to Sweetwater's main pasture, Daniel rode up beside Eleanor. "Might want to hang back, Miss Sutton," he suggested. "These ones are a bit skittish. Might bolt if they're not handled just right." Eleanor started to object, but recognized the wisdom in his words. She was a liability in this situation, not an asset. "I'll follow your lead, Daniel, but I expect you to explain what you're doing so I can learn." The young ranch hand grinned. "Yes, ma'am. That's fair." By sunset, they had successfully gathered most of Jacob's scattered herd and guided them back to the fenced pasture near the cabin. Eleanor dismounted awkwardly, her legs nearly buckling beneath her from hours in the saddle. Every muscle in her body protested, and she knew tomorrow would be worse. Martha approached as Eleanor leaned against the corral fence, trying to massage feeling back into her legs. "You did better than I expected," the older woman admitted. "But this was just one day, Eleanor. Ranching is relentless. Every day, every season, every year." "I'm aware," Eleanor replied, straightening despite her fatigue. And I'm grateful for your help today. I hope I can count on your guidance as I continue to learn." Martha studied her thoughtfully. "William and I will be back tomorrow to help with the branding. Those calves need to be marked before they grow anymore. After that," she shrugged, "we have our own place to run, but I'll check in when I can, and William seemed to take a shine to teaching you." After the Robertsons departed, Eleanor invited Daniel to stay for supper, desperate for more information about the practical aspects of running Sweetwater. The young man proved knowledgeable beyond his years. Having worked cattle since childhood, Mr. Miller was aiming to expand, he explained as they ate a simple meal of beans and cornbread. Said with a wife coming, he wanted to build something substantial, was hoping to double the herd within 2 years. "Do you think that's still possible?" Eleanor asked. Daniel considered, chewing thoughtfully. "Land's good here. Water's reliable even in dry years, but it takes capital to expand. And with the Blackwell gang causing trouble," he shrugged, "risky times for small spreads like this." Later, as Eleanor prepared for bed in the small bedroom that should have been her marital chamber, she catalogued the day's lessons with the same methodical attention she had once given to her studies at the seminary. She had learned the basics of Western riding, observed the techniques of herding cattle, and begun to understand the rhythms of ranch work. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, branding, which she gathered was both necessary and unpleasant. But as she extinguished the lamp and settled onto the straw-filled mattress, Eleanor felt a strange sense of accomplishment beneath her physical exhaustion. For the first time since arriving in the territory, she had taken active steps toward claiming her place here, toward transforming from the mail-order bride who never was into the rancher she would need to become. Outside, the Wyoming night spread its star-scattered canopy above Sweetwater Ranch. Coyotes called from distant ridges, and the spring wind whispered through the cottonwoods along the creek. Eleanor Sutton, once of Boston, now of Sweetwater, listened to these unfamiliar sounds and felt, despite everything, that she might be precisely where she belonged. The branding day dawned clear and cool, with a hint of warmth promising in the eastern sky. Eleanor had risen before first light, her body still aching from the previous day's exertions, but her mind sharp with purpose. She had studied Jacob's notes about branding by lamplight late into the night, determined not to appear completely ignorant when the Robertsons arrived. Daniel Tucker appeared just after sunrise, leading a pack mule loaded with additional equipment. "Morning, Miss Sutton," he greeted her cheerfully. "Brought the branding irons from the shed at the north pasture." Eleanor nodded, offering him coffee from the pot she'd prepared. "I appreciate your thoroughness, Daniel. The Robertsons should be here shortly." "Best get the fire started," he suggested, accepting the steaming cup. "Irons need plenty of time to heat." Following his instructions, Eleanor helped gather wood for a substantial fire in the clearing near the corral where they had penned the cattle yesterday. The prospect of what was to come, the actual branding of calves, filled her with apprehension. The process, as described in Jacob's notes, seemed necessarily cruel despite its practical purpose. William and Martha Robertson arrived as Daniel was arranging the branding irons at the edge of the now roaring fire. William led his horse to the corral and immediately began separating calves from their mothers, while Martha joined Eleanor by the fire. "Not for the faint of heart, branding day," the older woman commented, noting Eleanor's expression, "but necessary. A branded calf is a protected calf in these parts." "I understand the necessity," Eleanor replied. "I simply wish there were a gentler method." Martha's weathered face creased with a smile. "You sound like my Thomas when we first came west. He hated branding day too, but he knew, as you'll learn, that what seems cruel in the moment can be the greatest kindness in the long run." Rustlers won't bother with clearly branded stock, and if your cattle stray, everyone knows where to return them. The actual work began once the irons were properly heated. William and Daniel moved with practiced efficiency, separating a calf from the herd, roping it and bringing it to the branding area. Eleanor watched as they deftly flipped the struggling animal onto its side, William holding it down while Daniel pressed the glowing iron against its flank. The smell of burning hair and hide filled the air, along with the calf's distressed bawling. "Every ranch has its own brand," Martha explained as they watched. "Jacob's SM for Sweetwater Miller is registered with the Territorial Brand Office. It's your legal mark of ownership." Eleanor nodded, steeling herself against the sounds of the year. Frightened calves. Should I be helping more directly? Martha assessed her thoughtfully. "Can you manage a rope?" "Not yet." "Then for today, you can help by keeping the fire hot and the irons ready. Next year, God willing, you'll do more." Next year. The words gave Eleanor a strange comfort, the assumption that she would still be here, still fighting for Sweetwater. A year from now, by midday they had branded 15 calves. The men paused for the meal Eleanor had prepared, salt pork, beans and biscuits, all eating with the hearty appetite that came from physical labor. "You should file your claim paperwork soon," Martha advised as they ate. Territorial Land Office has a representative who visits Clearwater Creek on the first Monday of each month. That's 5 days from now. Eleanor nodded. "I've been reviewing Jacob's homestead documents. He had completed 3 years of the 5-year residency requirement, which means you'd need to maintain the property for 2 more years to secure full ownership," Martha confirmed, "but only if they accept your claim as intended." The afternoon's work proceeded more smoothly, with Eleanor finding her place in the rhythm of the branding. By sunset, all 27 of the spring calves bore the SM mark, ensuring their place in the Sweetwater herd. As they were cleaning up, the sound of approaching riders drew everyone's attention. Daniel, who had been dousing the branding fire, straightened abruptly, his hand moving to the revolver at his hip. "Expecting anyone, Miss Sutton?" William asked quietly, moving to stand beside her. Eleanor shook her head, anxiety tightening her chest as 3 mounted men approached from the east. They rode with the casual confidence of men accustomed to going where they pleased. Martha stepped forward, positioning herself slightly in front of Eleanor. "That's Emmett Hargrove," she murmured. "Owns the Double Bar Ranch to the east, been trying to buy up all the small spreads in the valley." The lead rider, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with silver-streaked hair and a neatly trimmed beard, reined his horse to a stop a respectful distance from the group. His pale eyes took in the scene, the branding fire's embers, the newly marked calves, and finally Eleanor herself, with calculating precision. "Mrs. Robertson," he greeted Martha with a slight tip of his hat. "William, wasn't expecting to find you folks over at Sweetwater today." "Neighborly assistance, Mr. Hargrove," Martha replied coolly. "Something you might not be familiar with." Hargrove's smile didn't reach his eyes. His gaze shifted to Eleanor. "And you must be Miller's mail-order bride. Sheriff Patterson mentioned you'd arrived. My condolences on your loss, Miss Sutton." "Eleanor Sutton," she replied, lifting her chin slightly. "And I thank you for your condolences, Mr. Hargrove." The rancher dismounted with the fluid ease of a lifetime horseman, handing his reins to one of his companions, who remained mounted. Terrible business with the Blackwell gang. Jacob was a good man. Not the most practical, perhaps, but hard-working. "Did you have business with Mr. Miller?" Eleanor asked directly. Hargrove's eyebrows rose slightly at her forthrightness. "As a matter of fact, I did. I made Jacob an offer for this property back in January. He turned me down then, but circumstances have changed." His gaze swept the modest ranch buildings. "I'm prepared to offer you a fair price for Sweetwater, Miss Sutton, enough to see you comfortably back east or wherever you might wish to go. "I have no intention of selling, Mr. Hargrove." The rancher's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "With respect, Miss Sutton, running a cattle operation isn't suitable work for a woman alone, especially with the Blackwell gang still at large. Why, they might return to finish what they started." The veiled threat wasn't lost on anyone present. William took a half-step forward, his hand resting casually near his gun belt. "I'm not alone, Mr. Hargrove," Eleanor replied evenly. "I have good neighbors and capable help." She nodded toward Daniel and the Robertsons. "And I intend to file my continuation claim on Jacob Miller's homestead next week." Hargrove's laugh held no humor. "A continuation claim? My dear lady, you weren't married to the man. The land office will never recognize such a claim." "That remains to be seen," Eleanor countered. "In the meantime, Sweetwater Ranch is not for sale at any price." The rancher studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "I admire your spirit, Miss Sutton, misplaced though it may be." He turned to remount his horse. "My offer stands for the next 30 days. After that," he shrugged. "Life has a way of clarifying one's priorities out here." After Hargrove and his men departed, the tension in the air slowly dissipated. Daniel busied himself with securing the branding equipment, while William led the horses to the water trough. "Emmett Hargrove doesn't make idle threats," Martha warned quietly. "He's been systematically acquiring land throughout the county. Those who won't sell often find themselves facing difficulties." "What sort of difficulties?" Eleanor asked. "Fences mysteriously cut, water sources fouled, cattle stampede or stolen." Martha's expression was grim. "Nothing that can be proven, of course. Hargrove is too clever for that." "You think he might be connected to the Blackwell gang? To Jacob's death?" Martha considered. "This. I wouldn't put it past him to employ men like Blackwell when it suits his purposes, but that's dangerous speculation without proof." That evening, after the Robertsons had departed and Daniel had retired to the small bunkhouse adjacent to the barn, Eleanor sat at Jacob's desk, her mind racing. The day had brought both progress and new concerns. The branding was complete, marking the calves as Sweetwater property. But Hargrove's visit had made clear that her claim to the ranch would be challenged, perhaps violently. She opened the drawer containing Jacob's personal papers and began a more thorough examination than she had previously undertaken. Among the homestead documents and cattle records, she found a folded sheet of paper that caught her attention. It was a half-completed letter in Jacob's neat handwriting, apparently intended for her, but never sent. "My dear Eleanor, by the time you read this, you will have arrived at Sweetwater, and we will have begun our life together. There is something I must confess that I have not mentioned in my previous letters. The situation in the territory has grown increasingly tense. A man named Emmett Hargrove has been pressuring me to sell the ranch to him. His methods have become progressively more threatening. Last month, 2 of my best cattle were shot dead in the north pasture. The sheriff can prove nothing." But the letter ended there, unfinished. Eleanor reread it, a chill settling in her chest. Jacob had been facing threats before his death, threats that now extended to her. If Hargrove was indeed behind the Blackwell gang's actions, then Jacob's death might have been no random act of violence, but a calculated murder. She carefully folded the letter and placed it in her pocket. This might be evidence worth sharing with Sheriff Patterson, though she doubted it would be enough to prompt official action against a man as powerful as Hargrove appeared to be. The next morning, Eleanor woke with a new purpose. If she was to secure her claim to Sweetwater and protect herself against Hargrove's machinations, she needed to establish herself more firmly, both legally and practically. Daniel arrived as she was finishing breakfast, ready for the day's work. "Thought we might ride the fence line today, Miss Sutton," he suggested. "Mr. Miller was particular about maintaining the boundaries." "An excellent idea," Eleanor agreed. "But first, I need to learn to shoot. The young ranch hand's eyebrows rose, in surprise. Shoot, Mom? Yes, Daniel. If I'm to defend this property, I must be able to handle firearms competently. She retrieved the shotgun and rifle from their place in the cabin. Will you teach me? Over the next several hours, Eleanor received a crash course in frontier marksmanship. Daniel set up targets, tin cans and bottles, along the corral fence, and patiently instructed her in the handling of both weapons. The shotgun proved easier for her to manage, its spread forgiving her initially poor aim. The rifle required more precision, and by midday her shoulder ached from the recoil, but she had managed to hit her target more often than not. You're a quick study, Miss Sutton, Daniel commented as they broke for a meal. Most folks take days to get comfortable with a firearm. Necessity is a powerful motivator, Eleanor replied, massaging her sore shoulder. Now tell me about the fence line. They spent the afternoon riding Sweetwater's boundaries, Daniel pointing out the landmarks that delineated the property. The ranch was roughly square in shape, with Sweetwater Creek running diagonally through it from the northwest corner to the southeast. The northern border was shared with the Robertsons' land, the eastern with Hargrove's Double Bar, and the southern and western edges bordered unclaimed territory. Mr. Miller was hoping to expand westward eventually, Daniel explained as they paused on a ridge overlooking a lush valley. Said that valley would be perfect for winter grazing. Eleanor studied the landscape, trying to see it through Jacob's eyes, not just as it was, but as it could be. How difficult would a claim on that land be to establish? Daniel considered. This. Need to file an adjacent homestead claim, prove it up with fencing improvements. It's doable, but it'd take capital and manpower. He trailed off, glancing awkwardly at Eleanor. That a woman alone doesn't have, she finished for him, a hint of challenge in her voice. Didn't mean it like that, Miss Sutton, Daniel backtracked. Just meant it's a big undertaking for any small ranch, especially with everything else that needs doing. Eleanor smiled to show she took no offense. You're right, of course. One step at a time. First, we secure what we have. As they continued their circuit of the property, Eleanor noted places where the fence required repair, several posts leaning dangerously, a section where wire had been stretched by what Daniel suggested might have been deer attempting to cross. These would be tomorrow's tasks. They returned to the ranch house as the sun was setting, both tired from the day's work, but with a sense of accomplishment. Eleanor had begun to form a mental map of Sweetwater, understanding its contours and characteristics in a way that made it seem more truly hers. After a simple supper, Daniel retired to the bunkhouse, and Eleanor was left alone with her thoughts. She found herself looking at the empty chair across the table, the place where Jacob would have sat, where they would have discussed the day's events and plans for tomorrow. The absence felt palpable. She opened Jacob's ledger again, turning to the page where he had last made an entry just days before his death. With careful deliberation, she picked up his pen, dipped it in ink, and made her first entry. May 3rd, 1878. Branded 27 spring calves with SM mark. Repaired North Corral fence, road property boundaries with D. Tucker. Received unwelcome visit from E. Hargrove, offering to purchase property. Offer declined. The simple act of recording the day's events in the ledger felt significant, a declaration of continuity, of her intention to carry forward what Jacob had begun. She added one more line. Weather clear, forecast favorable for fence repairs tomorrow. The following days fell into a rhythm of hard work and new learning. Eleanor's muscles gradually adjusted to the physical demands of ranch life. Though each evening still found her exhausted, Daniel proved an invaluable teacher, patiently instructing her in the basics of cattle management, fence repair, and the myriad other skills required to maintain Sweetwater. On Saturday, Martha Robertson rode over alone, bringing a package that aroused Eleanor's curiosity. Thought these might be useful, the older woman explained, unwrapping a bundle to reveal a pair of men's trousers, several work shirts, and a sturdy leather belt. "They belonged to my younger son James before he moved to Oregon. You and he are of similar height, though you'll need to take them in some." Eleanor touched the practical garments with appreciation. Her modified dresses had proven increasingly impractical for the work she was undertaking. "This is most generous, Martha. I've been considering something of this sort, but wasn't certain how to proceed." "Folks will talk, of course," Martha warned, with a wry smile, "but they'll talk regardless of what you do. Might as well be comfortable while they're yammering." That evening, Eleanor altered the trousers by lamplight, taking in the waist and shortening the legs to suit her frame. The work reminded her of evenings spent mending her father's clothing after her mother's death, practical skills that now served a new purpose. The following morning, she dressed in her new attire for the first time: trousers, a work shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and sturdy boots. The freedom of movement was immediate and exhilarating. When Daniel arrived, he did a double take at her appearance, but wisely made no comment beyond a nod of approval. Monday brought the visit to Clearwater, Greek, to file her claim paperwork with the Territorial Land Office representative. Eleanor wore her most respectable dress for the occasion, though she travelled to town on horseback rather than in the wagon, having gained enough confidence in her riding to make the journey securely. The Land Office representative, a bespectacled man named Harold Jenkins, received her in the back room of the Clearwater Creek Hotel with poorly concealed skepticism. "A continuation claim," he repeated, examining the papers she had prepared, "based on your status as Mr. Miller's intended bride." His tone made clear his doubt about the validity of such a claim. "Yes, Mr. Jenkins. As you can see, I have included our correspondence documenting the arrangement, as well as testimony from Sheriff Patterson confirming that I arrived for the express purpose of marrying Mr. Miller." Jenkins adjusted his spectacles. "Miss Sutton, while I sympathize with your situation, the Homestead Act typically recognizes continuation rights only for legal widows or blood relatives. The Act states that in the event of a homesteader's death, his widow, or in case of her death, his heirs may continue the claim," Eleanor countered, having memorized the relevant passage. "It does not specify that the widow must have been legally married prior to death, only that she is his widow." "That's a rather creative interpretation, Miss Sutton." "Perhaps, but one worth testing through proper legal channels." She met his gaze steadily. "I am prepared to appeal to the Territorial Land Commissioner if necessary," Jenkins sighed, recognizing a determined adversary. "I will forward your claim to the district office with my notes. The decision will ultimately rest with the Land Commissioner. In the meantime," he hesitated, "in the meantime, you may continue to occupy the property pending official determination." It wasn't the clear victory Eleanor had hoped for, but it was a start. Official acknowledgement of her claim, however. Tentative. As she rode back to Sweetwater that afternoon, she felt a cautious optimism. The legal battle for Jacob's ranch had begun, and she had taken the first step toward securing her place in this harsh but beautiful land. What she could not know, as she watched the sun setting over the western hills that bordered Sweetwater, was that forces were already gathering against her. Forces more dangerous than skeptical land office representatives or even arrogant neighboring ranchers. In a hidden canyon 20 miles to the south, Frank Blackwell and his gang were planning their next move, one that would bring them directly into conflict with the determined young woman who now called Sweetwater Ranch her home. The first warning came on a Wednesday morning, 2 weeks after Eleanor had filed her claim paperwork. She and Daniel were repairing a section of fence along the eastern boundary, the line that separated Sweetwater from Hargrove's Double Bar Ranch, when they noticed the dust cloud approaching from the south. "Riders," Daniel said, straightening. "From his work. 4. Maybe 5. Eleanor shaded her eyes against the morning sun, her pulse quickening. Since Hargrove's visit, they had encountered no further trouble, but she had taken to wearing Jacob's revolver on her hip whenever working. The property. Her hand moved unconsciously to the weapon now. "Recognize them?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. Daniel squinted into the distance. "Ain't Hargrove's men," he determined after a moment. "Different horses, and they're riding hard." As the riders drew closer, Eleanor could make out details that sent a chill through her. Mismatched clothing, unkempt beards, and the unmistakable glint of rifles in saddle scabbards. These weren't neighboring ranchers, or even Hargrove's hired hands. They looked like the sort of men who lived beyond the reach of law. "Daniel," she said quietly, "I think we should return to the ranch house. Now." The young man nodded, his freckled face unusually grave as he quickly gathered their tools. They mounted their horses and set off at a rapid trot toward the main buildings of Sweetwater, a mile distant. Eleanor resisted the urge to look back, focusing instead on the path ahead and the growing sense of danger. They had covered half the distance when the sound of hoofbeats behind them confirmed her fears. The riders had changed course to follow. Them. Daniel glanced over his shoulder, his expression hardening. "It's them," he said grimly. "The Blackwell gang. I recognize Frank Blackwell from the wanted posters." The name sent a jolt through Eleanor. The men who had killed Jacob, who had transformed her from bride-to-be to unofficial widow in an instant, were now pursuing her across her own land. The irony might have been striking, if not for the very real peril of the moment. "Can we outrun them?" she asked, already knowing the answer. Their workhorses were sturdy, but not bred for speed. "Not likely," Daniel admitted. "But we can make the ranch house before they catch us if we push hard." With that, he spurred his mount to a gallop, and Eleanor followed suit, clinging to Rusty's mane as the horse surged forward. They raced across the open grassland, the sound of pursuit growing steadily closer behind them. The ranch buildings came into view just as Eleanor heard a sharp crack, a rifle shot, and the whistle of a bullet passing overhead. Daniel hunched, lower in his saddle, and she followed his example, her heart pounding in her chest. "Don't stop!" Daniel shouted as they approached the yard. "Straight to the barn!" They thundered into the yard and reined their horses toward the barn's open doors. Inside, they dismounted swiftly, and Daniel immediately moved to close the heavy doors, sliding a wooden bar into place to secure them. "They'll have us trapped," Eleanor protested, trying to catch her breath. "Better trapped in here with cover than caught in the open," Daniel replied, moving quickly to a window that overlooked the yard. "We've got ammunition and supplies, and the walls are solid. Mr. Miller built this place to last." Eleanor joined him at the window, watching as the 5 riders drew up in the yard, just beyond effective pistol range. They made no attempt to conceal their presence or intentions, spreading out in a loose semicircle facing the barn. The man in the center, taller than the others, with a dark beard and a long duster coat, raised his hand, and the others halted. Frank Blackwell, the man responsible for Jacob's death. "That's far enough," Daniel called out, his rifle now positioned through the narrow window. "This is private property. State your business or move on." Blackwell's laugh carried clearly across the yard. "Private property," he says. He turned to his companions. "Boy's got spirit, I'll give him that." His attention returned to the barn. "We're here to speak with the new owner of Sweetwater Ranch, the mail-order bride who never got married." Eleanor felt a chill at his words. How did he know who she was? The answer came immediately: Emmett Hargrove. This was too coincidental otherwise. "I am Eleanor Sutton," she called out, keeping her voice level despite her fear. "What do you want?" "With me, Mr. Blackwell." The outlaw's eyebrows rose slightly at her directness. "Well now, the lady knows my name. I'm flattered." His expression hardened. "What I want is simple, Miss Sutton. This territory ain't hospitable to women trying to run ranches on their own. You've had your adventure out west. Time to sell to someone who can properly manage this land and head back east where you belong. And I suppose you have a buyer in mind, Eleanor replied, confirming her suspicion. Blackwell spread his hands in a gesture of mock innocence. I'm just delivering a friendly message. What you do with it is your affair. But I should mention, your predecessor didn't heed friendly warnings. Ended badly for him. The casual admission of Jacob's murder, delivered with such callous indifference, ignited something in Eleanor that momentarily overcame her fear. Are you confessing to the murder of Jacob Miller, Mr. Blackwell? Murder's such an ugly word, Miss Sutton. I prefer to think of it as market correction. His smile vanished. Now here's how this will proceed. You have 1 week to accept Hargrove's offer and clear out. After that, he shrugged. Well, ranching accidents happen all the time out here. Tragic, really. With that, he wheeled his horse around. His men followed suit, and within moments they had ridden away, heading east toward Hargrove's property. The implication couldn't have been clearer. Eleanor and Daniel remained in the barn until they were certain the gang had truly departed. As they finally emerged into the sunlight, Eleanor found her hands were shaking, not just with fear, but with rage. Jacob had been murdered not by random outlaws, but as part of a calculated scheme to seize his land. We need to tell Sheriff Patterson, Daniel said, leading the horses out of the barn. This is proof that Blackwell killed Mr. Miller and that Hargrove is behind it all. Eleanor shook her head, though she shared his outrage. It's our word against theirs, Daniel. 2 witnesses against a wealthy rancher with connections throughout the territory. We need more than accusations. So what do? Just wait for them to come back and kill us too? It was a fair question, one that Eleanor had been asking herself. Since the moment she understood the true nature of Jacob's death, the logical course would be to accept Hargrove's offer, to take what money she could get and return to Boston or try her luck elsewhere. In the West, it would certainly be the safer choice, but as she looked around at Sweetwater Ranch, at the land Jacob had loved enough to die for, at the future they were meant to build together, she knew she couldn't simply surrender it to the man who had orchestrated his murder. We fight, she said finally, but we need allies. Her first step was to ride to the Robertson Ranch that afternoon, accompanied by Daniel. Martha and William listened gravely as Eleanor recounted the confrontation with Blackwell and his explicit threats. Can't say I'm surprised, Martha said, when Eleanor had finished. Hargrove's been using intimidation tactics for years, but outright murder and employing known outlaws, that's a new level even for him. The problem is proving it, William added. Blackwell and his gang won't testify against Hargrove, and the man himself is too careful to leave evidence. Then we need to create the evidence, Eleanor replied, an idea forming, or rather lure them into creating it themselves. Her plan, outlined over Martha's kitchen table, was audacious and not without risk. They would spread word in Clearwater Creek that Eleanor had received a substantial advance on her inheritance from a wealthy uncle back east, money that would allow her to expand Sweetwater Ranch rather than sell it. The rumor, properly placed, would certainly reach Hargrove's ears. He won't risk letting you establish yourself more firmly, Martha predicted. He'll send Blackwell to intimidate you again, or worse. Exactly, Eleanor agreed, but this time we'll be prepared. Sheriff Patterson and his deputy will be hidden at Sweetwater, ready to witness whatever threats or actions Blackwell takes on Hargrove's behalf. William shook his head, concerned. That's assuming Patterson is willing to participate in such a scheme, and that Blackwell doesn't simply shoot first and make threats afterward. It's a risk, Eleanor acknowledged, but I see no alternative beyond surrendering Sweetwater to the man who murdered Jacob. After further discussion, Martha and William reluctantly agreed to help. The following day, Eleanor rode into Clearwater Creek accompanied by William, ostensibly to purchase supplies, but in reality to set their plan in motion. Their first stop was the sheriff's office, where Eleanor laid out the situation in detail, including Blackwell's explicit threats and the clear connection to Hargrove. Sheriff Patterson listened with increasing concern. "You're certain Blackwell admitted to killing Jacob on Hargrove's orders?" "He didn't name Hargrove directly," Eleanor clarified, "but the implication was unmistakable, especially when he mentioned that I should accept Hargrove's offer before meeting a similar fate." Patterson ran a hand through his greying hair. "It's still not enough for an arrest warrant, Miss Sutton, not against someone like Emmett Hargrove. The territorial judge would laugh me out of his courtroom, which is why we need to catch them." "In the act," Eleanor pressed. "If you and your deputy witness Blackwell threatening me on Hargrove's behalf, or better yet, attempting to carry out those threats, you'll have cause to arrest them both." The sheriff regarded her skeptically. "You're suggesting we use you as bait to catch a notorious outlaw and the most powerful rancher in the county. Do you understand how dangerous that would be?" "I understand that if we do nothing, I'll either lose Sweetwater or my life, possibly both." Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "Jacob Miller was murdered for his land, Sheriff. I won't let his killers profit from that crime." After nearly an hour of discussion, Patterson reluctantly agreed to participate in the plan, though with additional safeguards. He would bring not just his deputy, but several trusted men from town, all positioned strategically around the ranch house. The confrontation would be carefully managed to minimize risk. With the sheriff's tentative cooperation secured, the next step was to plant the rumor. William suggested the mercantile as the most effective starting point. Mrs. Holloway, the proprietor's wife, was known throughout the county for her enthusiastic dissemination of news and gossip. Eleanor made her purchases with deliberate care, selecting items that suggested long-term investment in Sweetwater: fencing tools, seeds for an expanded garden, even paint for the cabin's exterior. When Mrs. Holloway inevitably inquired about these preparations, Eleanor confided the story they had crafted, her uncle's generous financial support, and her plans to expand the ranch operations. "My uncle Bartholomew was quite impressed when he heard I was establishing myself out west," Eleanor explained, loudly enough for the other customers to overhear. "His letter arrived yesterday, along with a bank draft that will allow me to make significant improvements to Sweetwater." Mrs. Holloway's eyes widened with interest. "How wonderful for you, Miss Sutton. And will you be hiring additional help for these improvements?" "Indeed," Eleanor confirmed, embellishing further. "I plan to add at least 2 full-time ranch hands and commission a proper survey for additional water rights. Uncle Bartholomew believes Sweetwater could become one of the premier small ranches in the territory with proper investment." By the time they departed the mercantile, Eleanor was confident their story would spread throughout Clearwater Creek before nightfall and reach Hargrove's ears shortly thereafter. The following 3 days passed in tense preparation. Sheriff Patterson visited Sweetwater to plan the positioning of his men and establish signals for the anticipated confrontation. Daniel reinforced the barn and cabin windows, creating defensive positions from which they could fight if necessary. William Robertson brought additional firearms and ammunition from his family's ranch, ensuring that everyone involved would be adequately armed. On the morning of the 4th day, Martha arrived unexpectedly, dismounting from her horse with the brisk efficiency that characterized all her movements. "Hargrove was in town yesterday," she reported without preamble. "Spent a good hour with his banker, looking none too pleased when he emerged. Word is he's liquidating some assets quickly, possibly to increase his offer for Sweetwater before." "You can establish yourself too firmly," Eleanor nodded, understanding the implication. "So our rumors have reached him. The question is whether he'll try to intimidate me into selling quickly or move directly to more permanent solutions." Martha's expression was grim. "Based on what happened to Jacob, I wouldn't count on mere intimidation. You should assume Blackwell will come with deadly intent." That afternoon, Sheriff Patterson arrived with his deputy and 3 trusted townsmen, all armed and ready for what might be a dangerous confrontation. They positioned themselves according to the plan, the sheriff and one man in the barn with good sight lines to the approach road, the deputy and another man in the root cellar attached to the cabin, and the fifth man hidden in a stand of cottonwoods near the creek, where he could observe without being detected. Eleanor, Daniel and William would remain visible, going about normal ranch activities to maintain the appearance that they were unaware of any impending threat. When Blackwell and his men arrived, they would attempt to draw them into making explicit threats or confessions while the hidden witnesses listened. The wait was excruciating. As sunset approached with no sign of Blackwell or his gang, Eleanor began to fear their plan had failed, that perhaps Hargrove had seen through their deception or chosen a different approach altogether. She was in the garden, harvesting vegetables for the evening meal, when Daniel appeared at her side, his voice low and urgent. "Riders coming from the east," he murmured. "6 of them. Blackwell and his gang, plus one I don't recognize." Eleanor's heart rate accelerated, but she kept her movements casual, placing another tomato in her basket before straightening. "Is everyone in position?" "Yes. Sheriff Patterson says to let them approach. Try to keep them talking as long as possible." She nodded, brushing dirt from her hands onto her trousers. "Stay close, but not too close. Remember, we need them to incriminate themselves clearly." Daniel moved toward the barn, as if on a routine errand, while Eleanor continued her work in the garden, though every sense was now alert to the approaching danger. She heard the hoofbeats before she saw the riders, a steady rhythm that grew louder until 6 horsemen emerged around the bend in the road, approaching the ranch house with deliberate slowness. Frank Blackwell led the group, his dark duster now, complemented by a red bandana at his throat. Beside him rode a man Eleanor hadn't seen before, older, expensively dressed, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. With a jolt of recognition, she realized this must be Emmett Hargrove himself, come to witness the intimidation firsthand. The irony was almost amusing. They had hoped to lure Blackwell into implicating Hargrove, and instead, both men had delivered themselves directly into Sheriff Patterson's trap. Eleanor straightened as the riders entered the yard, setting down her basket and moving to stand before the cabin porch. William emerged from the barn, rifle held casually but visibly in the crook of his arm. Daniel appeared from the direction of the corral, positioning himself where he could intervene if necessary. Blackwell reined his horse to a stop 20 yards from where Eleanor stood, the other riders forming a line beside him. His gaze traveled from Eleanor to William and Daniel, assessing the situation with the cold calculation of a predator. "Miss Sutton," he called out, "I see you've ignored my friendly advice." "I found your advice neither friendly nor particularly compelling, Mr. Blackwell," Eleanor replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "And I see you've brought company this time." Hargrove nudged his horse forward slightly. "I thought it was time we met properly, Miss Sutton. Emmett Hargrove, at your service." His tone made the courtesy sound more like a threat. "I know who you are, Mr. Hargrove," Eleanor replied. "The question is, why are you here with the men who murdered Jacob Miller?" A flash of annoyance crossed Hargrove's features. "I'm here because you seem determined to cling to land you have no legal right to, land that could be put to proper use under experienced management. I've authorized my associate, Mr. Blackwell, to increase my offer for Sweetwater to $3,000. A generous sum, considering your tenuous claim." "Your associate?" Eleanor repeated, seizing the opening. "Is that what you call the man you hired to ambush and murder Jacob Miller when he refused to sell to you?" Hargrove's composure slipped. "Further, you're making dangerous accusations, Miss Sutton." "Am I?" Mr. Blackwell made the situation quite clear during his last visit. He admitted to killing Jacob as part of a market correction, I believe was the term. On whose behalf was he correcting the market, I wonder? Blackwell shifted in his saddle, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "You talk too much, woman. The offer's on the table. Take it and leave, or suffer the consequences." The consequences being another tragic ranching accident? Eleanor pressed. Like the one that killed Jacob Miller when he refused to sell to Mr. Hargrove. Exactly like that, Blackwell growled, his patience visibly fraying. You think we won't? That's enough, Hargrove interrupted sharply, his gaze fixed on Eleanor, cold and threatening. Miss Sutton, I came here to offer you a reasonable solution to your predicament. Since you prefer confrontation, let me be clear. You will sign over this property to me by noon tomorrow, or Mr. Blackwell and his associates will ensure that Sweetwater passes to new ownership through more permanent means. I trust I've made myself understood. It was the explicit threat they had been waiting for, witnessed not just by Daniel and William, but by Sheriff Patterson and his men in hiding. Eleanor drew herself up, prepared to signal the sheriff to make his move, when a shot rang out from behind the barn. One of Blackwell's men cried out, clutching his shoulder as he toppled from his horse. In an instant, the yard erupted into chaos. Blackwell drew his revolver, firing wildly toward the barn as he wheeled his horse around. Hargrove spurred his mount toward the road, clearly intent on escaping the ambush. Sheriff Patterson emerged from the barn, rifle raised. "Hold it right there, Blackwell! You're under arrest!" But the outlaw was already in motion, racing for the cover of the cottonwoods with his remaining men close behind. Hargrove had almost reached the bend in the road when the deputy emerged from his hiding place, firing a warning shot that caused the rancher's horse to rear in panic, throwing him to the ground. Within moments, the yard became a battlefield. Eleanor ducked behind the water trough as bullets splintered wood around her. She could hear Sheriff Patterson shouting orders to his men, trying to contain the situation before it spun completely out of control. Through the chaos, one thought burned in Eleanor's mind. They had succeeded in exposing the conspiracy between Hargrove and Blackwell, but at a terrible cost. What had begun as a carefully planned trap had descended into a violent confrontation with an uncertain outcome. As she gripped Jacob's revolver and prepared to defend herself if necessary, Eleanor Sutton faced the stark reality of frontier justice. Sometimes the only way to claim what was rightfully yours was to fight for it, whatever the consequences. Might be gunfire echoed across Sweetwater Ranch as the standoff dissolved into open combat. Eleanor remained crouched behind the water trough, Jacob's revolver clutched in her trembling hands. Through gaps in the wooden slats, she could see Sheriff Patterson and his deputy exchanging fire with Blackwell's men, who had taken cover behind the corral fence. Hargrove was pinned down near the road, trapped between the deputy's position and the man stationed in the cottonwoods. The wealthy rancher looked utterly out of his element, his face pale with fear as bullets whizzed overhead. A movement to her left caught Eleanor's attention. Daniel was crawling toward her, keeping low to avoid the gunfire. "Miss Sutton," he called out when he was close enough to be heard over the shooting. "We need to get you inside the cabin. It's too exposed out here." Eleanor nodded, understanding the logic, but reluctant to abandon her position. The water trough offered limited protection, but making a dash for the cabin would mean crossing 15 yards of open ground directly in the line of fire. Before she could respond, William Robertson's voice rang out from the barn. "Blackwell! Your men are surrounded. Throw down your weapons." The outlaw's response was another barrage of gunfire that splintered the barn door. "You think I haven't been in worse spots than this?" Blackwell shouted. "I'm riding out of here, and I'm taking Hargrove with me. Anyone tries to stop us, they're dead." Sheriff Patterson had worked his way to a position behind the woodpile, giving him a clear view of both Blackwell's position and the yard. "That's not happening, Frank. You're wanted for murder and a dozen other crimes. This ends today." As the men exchanged threats and gunfire, Eleanor studied the situation with growing clarity. Blackwell was pinned down but desperate, a dangerous combination. Hargrove, despite his fine clothes and arrogant manner, looked like a man who had never expected to find himself in a gun battle. His usual confidence had evaporated, replaced by naked fear. Daniel, she whispered, if we can capture Hargrove, Blackwell loses his protection. Without Hargrove's money and influence, he's just another outlaw. The young ranch hand considered this. Hargrove's only about 30 yards from here. If we create a distraction, I might be able to circle around. Through the garden and come up behind him. Eleanor shook her head. Too risky, but we might be able to force him to surrender. She raised her voice. Mr. Hargrove, you're caught between Sheriff Patterson's men with nowhere to run. Do you really intend to die for Frank Blackwell today? Hargrove's head jerked up at her words, his eyes finding her partially concealed position. This is your fault, woman, he snarled. If you'd sold the ranch like any sensible person, none of this would be happening. Is that what you told Jacob Miller before you had him murdered? Eleanor called back, aware that her words might provoke him, but determined to press her advantage. Did you offer him one last chance to sell before ordering Blackwell to kill him? The wealthy rancher's face contorted with rage. Miller was a fool. This entire valley should be mine. I offered him 3 times what this worthless patch of dirt was worth, and he refused out of sheer stubbornness. His words carried clearly across the yard, a confession spoken in anger but heard by multiple witnesses. Sheriff Patterson seized the moment. Emmett Hargrove, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder and hiring outlaws to commit criminal acts, he announced, rising slightly from his position to make his authority clear. Throw down any weapons and surrender yourself. Hargrove's expression shifted from rage to disbelief as he realized the full implications of his outburst. He had just confessed to orchestrating Jacob Miller's murder in front of the county sheriff and multiple witnesses. For a moment, the gunfire ceased as all parties processed this turning point. Then Blackwell's harsh laugh cut through the silence. You're finished, Hargrove, the outlaw called out. No highfalutin lawyer can talk you out of a public confession to murder. His tone turned menacing. And a man with nothing to lose makes a dangerous enemy. The threat in Blackwell's words was unmistakable. Hargrove had become a liability, one the outlaw couldn't afford to leave alive to testify against him. The wealthy rancher seemed to realize this as well, his face draining of color. Patterson, Hargrove called out, his voice cracking. I surrender to your custody. Protect me from Blackwell, and I'll testify about everything. The arrangement, the money, all of it. Sheriff Patterson signaled to his deputy, who began moving carefully toward Hargrove's position. Throw your gun away from you and keep your hands where I can see them, the sheriff instructed. Hargrove complied, tossing a small derringer into the dust and raising his hands above his head. The deputy reached him moments later, quickly binding his wrists with rope before pulling him toward the relative safety of the cabin. Blackwell watched this development with cold fury. Hargrove, you yellow-bellied coward, he shouted. You think they can protect you from me? I'll find you wherever they hide you. As the deputy hustled Hargrove past the water trough, where Eleanor remained concealed, the rancher's eyes met hers with undisguised hatred. This isn't over, he hissed. You'll never prove any of this in court. My lawyers will save it for the judge, the deputy interrupted, pushing him roughly toward the cabin door. With Hargrove in custody, the dynamics of the standoff shifted. Blackwell and his remaining men, now only 3 with 1 wounded, faced diminishing options. They were outnumbered, outpositioned, and had lost their powerful patron. Blackwell, Sheriff Patterson called out. Your employer just sold you out. Surrender now, and I'll guarantee you a fair trial. The outlaw's response was predictably defiant. Fair trial? We both know what that means. A rope and a short drop. He fired another shot toward the sheriff's position. I'm riding out of here. Patterson, try to stop me and more people will die today. Eleanor, still crouched behind the water trough with Daniel, could see the determination in Blackwell's stance, even from a distance. This was a man who had lived outside the law for so long that surrender was unthinkable. He would rather die, fighting than face justice for his crimes. And yet, there was something else in his manner, a calculating patience that suggested he was waiting for something. Eleanor scanned the surroundings, trying to discern what advantage Blackwell might be anticipating when Daniel grabbed her arm. "The horses," he whispered urgently. "His men are inching toward the corral. They're going to make a break for it." He was right. While Blackwell kept the sheriff's attention with periodic gunfire, his men had been gradually working their way closer to the corral, where several horses, including the gang's own mounts, were penned. If they reached the horses, they could create enough chaos to cover their escape. "We need to stop them," Eleanor said, gripping her revolver with renewed determination. "If Blackwell escapes, he'll come back. For Hargrove, for the sheriff, for us. This has to end here." Daniel nodded grimly. "I can reach the barn through the garden without being seen. From there, I can cover the corral, keep them from the horses." "I'll distract Blackwell," Eleanor decided, formulating a plan that was either brave or foolhardy, perhaps both. "When I give the signal, move quickly. And Daniel—" She met his eyes. "Be careful." Before he could protest, Eleanor raised her voice. "Mr. Blackwell, I have a proposition for you." The outlaw's head turned sharply in her direction. "Unless you're offering me Hargrove's head on a platter, I ain't interested, lady." "I'm offering you a way out," Eleanor replied, choosing her words carefully to hold his attention, while Daniel slipped away toward the garden. "Hargrove has implicated you in Jacob Miller's murder, but his testimony alone may not be enough for a conviction. It's the word of a desperate man trying to save himself." She could see she had his interest now. Blackwell was too experienced not to recognize the truth in her assessment. Courts were often reluctant to convict on the testimony of a co-conspirator alone, especially when that testimony was given in exchange for leniency. "What's your point?" Blackwell demanded, his gun still trained in her general direction, but his finger was no longer on the trigger. "My point is that Sheriff Patterson might be willing to focus his case on Hargrove if a certain outlaw were to disappear from the territory." "Permanently," Eleanor suggested, knowing full well that Patterson would never agree to such an arrangement, but needing to keep Blackwell engaged. From the corner of her eye, she could see Daniel had almost reached the garden gate. Sheriff Patterson, understanding her strategy, if not approving of it, played along. "Miss Sutton, I can't make that kind of deal without consulting the territorial judge. But you could delay pursuit for, say, 24 hours, Eleanor pressed, maintaining the fiction. "Give Mr. Blackwell and his associates time to put substantial distance between themselves and Wyoming territory." Blackwell's laugh held no humor. "You expect me to believe the righteous Sheriff Patterson would let me ride away after what happened? To Miller, after what I just heard Hargrove confess? I expect you to recognize that Hargrove is the bigger prize," Eleanor countered. "A wealthy, respected rancher who hired outlaws to murder his neighbor for land. That's a story that will make headlines across the territory. The famous Frank Blackwell becomes merely a footnote, a hired gun who did another man's dirty work." She could see the barb strike home in the tightening of Blackwell's jaw. Men like him survived on their reputation as much as their guns, and the suggestion that he was merely Hargrove's instrument clearly rankled. "I'm nobody's errand boy," he snarled. "Hargrove paid well, but the plan to ambush Miller and his friends was mine. 3 men with 1 volley. Clean work that took planning and patience." It was another confession, spoken in wounded pride, but heard clearly by everyone present. Eleanor felt a grim satisfaction even as she continued her dangerous game. Then, wouldn't it be better to be remembered for outwitting a sheriff's posse? For riding away when they had you surrounded? As she spoke, she saw Daniel had reached the barn and was now positioned at a window with a clear view of the corral. The ranch hand raised his rifle slightly, the signal that he was in position. "Now, Sheriff!" Eleanor shouted, dropping to the Ground as gunfire erupted once more. Daniel's first shot struck the man nearest the corral, sending him tumbling to the dust with a cry of pain. Sheriff Patterson and his men seized the moment, directing concentrated fire at Blackwell's position behind the fence. The outlaw returned fire furiously, bullets splintering wood and digging divots in the earth around Eleanor's position. From a low vantage point, Eleanor could see one of Blackwell's men breaking cover, making a desperate run for the horses despite Daniel's presence. The young ranch hand's rifle cracked again, and the man fell, clutching his leg. Blackwell, realizing his planned escape route was compromised, changed tactics with the adaptability that had kept him alive through years as an outlaw. Instead of continuing to exchange fire with the sheriff's men, he suddenly vaulted over the fence and sprinted toward the cabin where Hargrove was being held. "He's going for Hargrove!" Eleanor shouted, raising her revolver and firing a shot that went wide of the running man. Sheriff Patterson emerged from cover, rifle raised, but hesitated to fire with the cabin in his line of sight. Blackwell reached the cabin porch in 3 long strides and kicked open the door, disappearing inside. A moment of terrible silence followed, then a single gunshot echoed from within the cabin. Eleanor's heart seemed to stop. The deputy had been guarding Hargrove inside. Had Blackwell shot him, or had the deputy managed to defend himself and his prisoner? The answer came moments later when Blackwell reappeared in the doorway, dragging a struggling Hargrove before him as a human shield, a revolver pressed to the rancher's temple. The deputy was nowhere to be seen. "Drop your weapons," Blackwell shouted, "or Hargrove gets a bullet in his brain right here." Sheriff Patterson held up a hand, signaling his men to hold their fire. "Think about what you're doing, Frank. Killing. Hargrove won't get you out of this." "Maybe not," Blackwell acknowledged, his expression hard, "but it'll ensure he doesn't testify against me or anyone else. Now I want horses for me and my men, saddled and ready in 5 minutes. Or the great Emmett Hargrove dies on a dirt ranch that should have been his." Eleanor, watching from her position behind the water trough, assessed the situation with growing dread. Blackwell had nothing to lose now. If he escaped with his men, they would almost certainly return later to eliminate witnesses. If he was cornered, he would kill Hargrove, and likely as many others as he could before being brought down himself. As she considered their dwindling options, her gaze fell on the cabin's side window, slightly ajar, offering a clear angle to where Blackwell stood on the porch with Hargrove. The outlaw's attention was fixed on Sheriff Patterson and the men in the yard, his back partially turned to that window. Without giving herself time to reconsider, Eleanor began crawling backward, using the garden beds as cover until she reached the side of the cabin unobserved. The voices from the front yard continued, Blackwell making demands, Patterson trying to negotiate, Hargrove pleading for his life in increasingly desperate tones. Eleanor moved silently to the side window, raising herself just enough to peer inside. The cabin's interior was dim after the bright sunlight outside, but she could make out a figure slumped against the far wall. The deputy, apparently wounded but still conscious, his hand pressed to his bleeding shoulder. Their eyes met, and the deputy gave an almost imperceptible nod. He understood what she was attempting and would not interfere. Eleanor drew Jacob's revolver, checking that all chambers were loaded before carefully positioning herself at the window. From this angle, she had a clear shot at Blackwell's exposed side. If she didn't miss, if her hands didn't shake, if she could bring herself to pull the trigger. Eleanor had never shot a man before. She had been raised in genteel Boston society, where ladies employed proper channels, law enforcement, courts, social pressure, to address injustices. But Jacob Miller had employed those proper channels too, and he had ended up dead in a wagon massacre, his killers unpunished until now. She thought of the life she had journeyed west to build, the partnership with a man who had wanted not just a wife but an equal, the promising ranch they were to develop together, the future that had been violently stolen before it could begin. She thought of Martha Robertson's words that first day. "This land tests everyone who comes here, but it rewards those who persevere." Outside, Blackwell's patience was wearing thin. 2 minutes, Patterson. Then Hargrove dies, and we start on. "The rest of you," Eleanor steadied her breathing, raised the revolver with both hands, and aimed carefully at the spot where Blackwell's heart would be. Jacob's revolver, the weapon he had carried for protection in this untamed land, felt suddenly right in her hands, as if completing a circle of justice. "For Jacob," she whispered, and pulled the trigger. The gunshot seemed impossibly loud in the confined space of the cabin. Through the window, Eleanor saw Blackwell jerk violently, his grip on Hargrove loosening as he staggered backward. The outlaw's expression registered shock before he crumpled to the porch floor, his revolver clattering harmlessly beside him. Hargrove, suddenly free, stumbled forward into the yard, where Sheriff Patterson's men quickly secured him once more. The sheriff himself approached Blackwell's fallen form cautiously, rifle raised, until he confirmed what Eleanor already knew. Her shot had found its mark. Frank Blackwell, the man who had murdered Jacob Miller, would never threaten anyone again. In the aftermath, as the sheriff's men rounded up the remaining outlaws and tended to the wounded deputy, Eleanor sat quietly on the cabin porch, still, holding Jacob's revolver in her lap. She felt neither triumph nor regret, only a somber certainty that she had done what was necessary to protect what was hers, and to obtain a measure of justice for the man she had traveled so far to marry. Martha Robertson found her there as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the yard where blood now stained the dust. The older woman settled beside her without speaking, her weathered hand coming to rest supportively on Eleanor's shoulder. "You did what had to be done," Martha said finally, breaking the silence. Eleanor nodded, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "I didn't come west to kill men, Martha. I came to build something." "And you will," Martha assured her. "But sometimes, before you can build, you have to clear the ground." She paused, studying Eleanor's profile in the fading light. "The question is, are you still determined to make Sweetwater your home after all this?" Eleanor considered the question, seriously. The day's events had changed her, had revealed a strength and resolve she hadn't known she possessed, but had also shown her the harsh realities of frontier justice. Could she truly build a life in a place where such violence might always be just over the horizon? As she pondered this, Sheriff Patterson approached, his expression grave but respectful. "Miss Sutton, I need to formally take your statement about what happened here today." He hesitated, then added, "For what it's worth, the territorial prosecutor will almost certainly rule it justifiable homicide. Blackwell was threatening lives, and you acted to protect both Hargrove and my deputy." "What will happen to Hargrove?" Eleanor asked, finally looking up from the revolver in her lap. "He'll stand trial for conspiring to murder Jacob Miller," Patterson replied, "with his confession witnessed by multiple people, including myself, and with whatever testimony he provides against Blackwell's remaining gang members in exchange for avoiding the hangman's noose. Well, I expect he'll be spending many years in territorial prison." "And Sweetwater Ranch?" Eleanor pressed. "My claim to it." The sheriff's expression softened slightly. "After today, Miss Sutton, I don't think anyone in the territory would question your right to this land. You've defended it as fiercely as any homesteader I've ever seen, more so than most, truth be told." As Patterson moved away to supervise the removal of the day's casualties, Martha squeezed Eleanor's shoulder gently. "He's right, you know. This land is yours now, in a way that no land office paperwork could ever make it. You've claimed it with courage and blood, the same way every inch of this territory has been claimed since the first settlers arrived." Eleanor finally holstered the revolver, her decision made. Then I'll stay and build what Jacob and I planned together, a prosperous ranch, a respectable home, a place that honors his memory and the future we might have shared. As darkness fell, over Sweetwater Ranch, Eleanor Sutton, no longer the mail-order bride who never was, but the woman who had fought for her rightful place on the frontier, rose from the porch and stepped into the cabin that was now truly hers. Tomorrow would bring the work of rebuilding after violence, of healing the wounds both visible and hidden, of moving forward into a future she would shape with her own hands. The land had tested her, as Martha had predicted that first day, and Eleanor had proven herself worthy of the legacy she had inherited, not just Jacob Miller's ranch, but the spirit of determination and resilience that defined the American frontier. Word of the shootout at Sweetwater Ranch spread through the territory like wildfire. By the time Eleanor rode into Clearwater Creek the following week, the story had grown to near mythic proportions, embellished with each telling until she had single-handedly defeated Blackwell's entire gang while simultaneously exposing Emmett, Hargrove's murderous conspiracy. The reality had been messier, more morally ambiguous, and far less heroic than the tales now being shared in hushed tones at the Mercantile and with boisterous enthusiasm at the saloon. Eleanor had killed a man, a fact that continued to weigh on her despite the circumstances that had made it necessary. She had taken no pleasure in Blackwell's death, only a grim satisfaction that Jacob's murderer had faced justice and would threaten no one else. Sheriff Patterson met her outside his office, his expression suggesting he had news to share. "Miss Sutton," he greeted her with a respectful nod. "I was hoping you'd come to town today. There are some developments you should know about." Inside, he offered her coffee, which she accepted gratefully after the long ride. The sheriff's office felt different now. No longer an intimidating representation of territorial authority, but simply a place of business, run by a man who had stood beside her during her darkest hours. "Hargrove's been formally charged," Patterson began once they were seated. "The territorial prosecutor arrived yesterday. Based on the evidence and witness testimonies, they're pursuing charges of conspiracy to commit murder, hiring outlaws for criminal purposes, and obstruction of justice." "Will it be enough to convict him?" Eleanor asked, still wary of Hargrove's connections and influence. "With 6 witnesses to his confession?" Patterson smiled grimly. Even the finest lawyer in the territory couldn't talk his way around that. And Hargrove's former allies are distancing themselves rapidly now that the full story has emerged. No one wants to be associated with a man who hired outlaws to murder his neighbors. Eleanor nodded, relieved but not surprised. The frontier valued many things: strength, determination, resourcefulness, but it held particular contempt for those who wouldn't do their own dirty work, who hid behind hired guns while maintaining a veneer of respectability. "Now, there's more," Patterson continued, his expression softening. "I received this from the Territorial Land Office yesterday." He handed her an official-looking document bearing several impressive seals. "They've approved your continuation claim for Sweetwater Ranch. The full property rights are yours, pending completion of the remaining homestead requirements." Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she accepted the document. After weeks of uncertainty, of fighting for what she believed was rightfully hers, here was official confirmation. Sweetwater Ranch belonged to her. She had 2 more years to prove up the claim by making the improvements required under the Homestead Act, but the land itself was secure. "Thank you, Sheriff," she said quietly, carefully folding the document and placing it in her handbag. "Don't thank me," he replied with unexpected candor. "When you first arrived and announced your intention to take over Miller's ranch, I thought you were either naive or delusional. Most city women would have been on the first stage back east after what you've endured." He shook his head, genuine respect in his eyes. "You've earned that land, Miss Sutton, in ways the Homestead Act never anticipated." As Eleanor left the sheriff's office, she felt a subtle shift in how the townspeople regarded her. There were respectful nods from men who had previously dismissed her and curious, evaluating glances from women who had initially viewed her with pity or skepticism. She was no longer merely Miller's mail-order bride or that Eastern woman, but Eleanor Sutton of Sweetwater Ranch, a person of substance in her own right. At the Mercantile, Mrs. Halloway greeted her with uncharacteristic deference. "Miss Sutton, we've all been talking about your ordeal with those terrible outlaws. So brave of you to stand your ground." Eleanor accepted the praise with a polite smile while purchasing supplies with a new sense of purpose. With her claim secure and the immediate threats removed, she could focus on building Sweetwater into the prosperous ranch Jacob had envisioned, that they had both envisioned during their months of correspondence. Sarah Donovan, the widow she had met at Jacob's funeral, approached as Eleanor was arranging her purchases to be loaded onto her wagon. "I heard what happened," Sarah said without preamble, "about Hargrove and Blackwell and how you handled it." Her direct gaze held approval and something like camaraderie. "My Michael always said the Hargroves of this world would eventually overreach. He'd have been pleased to see Emmett get his comeuppance. I wish it hadn't required such extreme measures." Eleanor replied, still uncomfortable with being lauded for actions born of desperation rather than heroism. Sarah nodded, understanding in her eyes. "The first time I had to shoot a wolf threatening our livestock, I cried afterward. Couldn't sleep for 2 nights thinking about it. But out here, protecting what's yours sometimes means doing things you never imagined yourself capable of." She paused, then added, "I'm hosting a quilting circle at my ranch next Thursday. Nothing fancy, just a few neighboring women working together while sharing a meal. You'd be welcome to join us." The invitation represented something significant: acceptance into the small community of women who had also chosen this difficult frontier life. Eleanor accepted with genuine gratitude, recognizing the value of female companionship and support in the predominantly male world of ranching. When she returned to Sweetwater that afternoon, she found Daniel Tucker and William Robertson repairing the bullet damage to the barn and corral. The young men had formed a friendship during the confrontation with Blackwell's gang, united by their shared experience and mutual respect. "Mail came," Daniel called out as she approached. "Land office papers and a letter from Boston." The letter bore the return address of Eleanor's former teaching colleague, Margaret Whitmore. Inside was news of Boston, of mutual acquaintances, school developments, and social events that now seemed to belong to another lifetime. Margaret expressed concern about Eleanor's rash adventure and gently suggested that perhaps it was time to consider returning to civilization, especially given the tragic circumstances of Jacob's death. Eleanor folded the letter thoughtfully. 3 months ago, she had boarded a train in Boston with trembling excitement, embarking on a journey toward an unknown future with a man she had never met. She had been seeking partnership, purpose, and perhaps adventure, though not the kind that had ultimately found her. Now, standing on the porch of what was truly her home, she realized how profoundly she had changed. Eleanor Sutton, who had taught proper young ladies in a Boston schoolroom, would scarcely recognize the woman who now wore trousers for practical ranch work, who could ride and shoot and withstand hardships that would have once seemed insurmountable. Return to Boston. The very thought felt confining, like contemplating a return to childhood clothing long outgrown. "Everything all right, Miss Sutton?" William asked, noticing her distracted expression as he paused in his work. "Yes," she replied with newfound certainty. "Just a letter from my old life." That evening, Eleanor sat at Jacob's desk, her desk, now, and opened the ledger to a fresh page. The ranch accounts needed updating, plans needed documenting. With Hargrove's threat removed and her claim officially recognized, she could look toward the future with more confidence. The next morning brought Martha Robertson, who had become something of a mentor in Eleanor's transition to ranch life. The older woman dismounted with her usual brisk efficiency, but there was a thoughtfulness in her expression that suggested her visit had a specific purpose. "Thought we might discuss your plans for Sweetwater," Martha said as they settled on the porch with coffee. Now that the immediate troubles are behind you, Eleanor had been considering this very question. "I intend to realize Jacob's vision for the ranch," she explained, "with some adaptations of my own. The cattle operation will remain the core, but I'm considering diversifying somewhat." Martha nodded approvingly. "Smart thinking. What did you have in mind?" "The garden is already producing well, better than I expected. With expansion, we could supply vegetables to Clearwater Creek regularly. I've also been reading about sheep." "Sheep?" Martha interrupted, eyebrows raised. "That's a contentious topic in cattle country." "So I've gathered," Eleanor acknowledged. "But the wool market is strong, and sheep can graze on land that's less suitable for cattle. If managed carefully, the two operations could complement each other." The discussion continued, with Martha offering practical insights drawn from 15 years of Wyoming ranching experience. She neither encouraged nor discouraged Eleanor's ideas, simply helped refine them with the perspective that only experience could provide. "There's another matter I wanted to discuss," Martha said finally, setting down her empty cup. "William has taken a strong interest in Sweetwater's development." Eleanor had noticed the young man's increased presence since the confrontation with Blackwell and Hargrove. "He's been invaluable in the repairs," she agreed, "and his knowledge of cattle management far exceeds my own, despite Daniel's patient tutoring." Martha's direct gaze held a hint of maternal calculation. "William has mentioned expanding our operation at the Northridge, but I suspect his interests lie increasingly to the south, specifically here at Sweetwater." The implication was clear, and Eleanor felt a flush rise to her cheeks. William Robertson was indeed a capable young rancher, hard-working, knowledgeable, and not unattractive. Under different circumstances in another life, she might have considered him a suitable match. "Martha," she began carefully, "I came west to marry a man I had never met because his letters revealed a kindred spirit, someone who valued partnership over traditional marriage, who sought an equal rather than a subordinate. I cannot simply transfer that commitment to William, regardless of his qualities." The older woman nodded, unsurprised. "I thought you might feel that way, and it's to your credit." She paused, then added with practical directness, "But you should know that running Sweetwater alone won't get easier. The work is constant, the challenges numerous. Even with hired help, it's a burden few single women would choose to bear." "I didn't come west for an easy life," Eleanor replied simply. "I came for a meaningful one." Martha's weathered face creased in a smile. "Then you've certainly found it." She rose to leave, but turned back with a final observation. "You know, Eleanor, partnership takes many forms. Not all involve marriage. William respects what you're building here. Just something to consider for the future." As summer progressed into early autumn, Eleanor settled into the rhythms of ranch life with growing confidence. Daniel remained her steady right hand, now joined by a second ranch hand, a quiet, competent man named Thomas Jenkins, whom Sheriff Patterson had recommended. With their help, Sweetwater's operations expanded gradually, but purposefully. The summer roundup proved successful, with more calves surviving than Jacob's projections had anticipated. Eleanor meticulously recorded each development in the ledger, noting with satisfaction the increasing columns of figures that represented Sweetwater's growing prosperity. Her vegetable garden flourished beyond expectation, producing enough that she was able to establish a regular arrangement with Mrs. Halloway at the Mercantile. Each Saturday, she delivered fresh produce to town, returning with supplies and an increasing sense of being part of the Clearwater Creek community rather than merely adjacent to it. Sarah Donovan's quilting circle became a monthly constant, a precious opportunity for female companionship and the exchange of practical knowledge that couldn't be found in books. Eleanor learned to preserve fruits, to identify medicinal plants, to predict weather changes from subtle signs the other women had observed through years on the frontier. In return, she shared her own knowledge, helping Sarah's oldest daughter improve her reading skills, teaching basic accounting to several of the women who managed their family finances, introducing recipes from her Boston upbringing adapted to frontier ingredients and cooking methods. Yet for all the physical transformation of Sweetwater, the more profound change had occurred within Eleanor herself. The Boston schoolteacher who had arrived in Wyoming territory seeking marriage to a stranger had been replaced by a confident rancher who made her own decisions, managed her own affairs, and had earned the respect of a community initially dubious about her abilities and resolve. The riders appeared on the eastern road shortly before noon. Sheriff Patterson, easily recognizable, on his tall bay gelding, accompanied by a stiff-looking man in a dark suit that marked him as a government official from miles away. Eleanor straightened her shoulders and moved to greet them as they entered the yard. "Miss Sutton," Patterson called out warmly as he dismounted, "may I present Mr. Howard Jenkins, representing the Territorial Land Office." The land official dismounted, with less grace, clearly unaccustomed to lengthy rides. "Miss Sutton," he greeted her with formal courtesy, "I understand this is the final inspection for your homestead patent." "It is," Eleanor confirmed, leading them toward the house where she had prepared refreshments in anticipation of their arrival. "I have all the documentation ready for your review." The inspection itself was largely a formality. Jenkins verified boundary markers, examined the improvements to the property, and reviewed Eleanor's meticulous records with an appreciation that gradually overcame his initial bureaucratic stiffness. By mid-afternoon, he was satisfied that all requirements had been met or exceeded. "Everything appears to be in order," he announced, affixing his official seal to the patent documents that would secure Eleanor's permanent ownership of Sweetwater Ranch. "The patent will be officially recorded in Cheyenne, but this copy is yours to keep as proof of title. Congratulations, Miss Sutton. The property is now legally yours." As Eleanor accepted the document, she felt a complex wave of emotions: pride in what she had accomplished, gratitude toward those who had helped her along the way, and a bittersweet acknowledgement of Jacob Miller, whose dream she had inherited and transformed. Sheriff Patterson seemed to sense her thoughts. "Miller would be proud of what you've built here," he said quietly, as Jenkins packed his documents. "This place has become exactly what he hoped for, maybe more." After the officials departed, Eleanor found herself alone on the porch as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. The patent document lay on her lap, its official seals and formal language converting 2 years of struggle and growth into dry legal terminology that couldn't begin to capture the true story of Sweetwater Ranch. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention. William Robertson rode into the yard, his tall figure silhouetted against the afternoon sun. In the 2 years since he had first proposed a business partnership between their ranches, their relationship had evolved into something neither of them had initially anticipated. The business arrangement had indeed proven beneficial to both properties. The Robertson-Sweetwater partnership now controlled nearly 2,000 acres of prime grazing land, allowing them to compete effectively with larger operations. But alongside that practical alliance had grown a deeper connection, one built on mutual respect, shared challenges, and the gradual discovery that their differing perspectives often complemented rather than contradicted each other. "I heard the land office was coming today," William said, as he joined her on the porch. "Judging by your expression, I take it the news was good?" Eleanor held up the patent document with a smile. "Sweetwater is officially mine. All requirements satisfied, all paperwork approved. Congratulations." His smile was genuine, his pride in her accomplishment evident. Not that there was ever any doubt. "There was plenty of doubt," Eleanor corrected him. "From the sheriff, from the land office, from half the county, even from me in the beginning." William nodded, acknowledging the truth in her words. "But never from me," he said quietly. It was true. From their first meeting, when she had been a city woman awkwardly holding a shotgun on the porch of what was to have been her marital home, William had treated her with a respect that had initially surprised her. While others had questioned her ability to manage Sweetwater, he had simply offered practical assistance and honest advice, allowing her to prove herself on her own terms. They sat in comfortable silence as the sunset painted the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. So much had changed since Eleanor's arrival in Wyoming territory, yet the vast sky and rugged landscape remained constant, a backdrop against which human dramas played out, leaving marks that would one day fade like hoofprints after rain. "I've been thinking," William said finally, breaking the contemplative silence. "Our partnership has worked well these past 2 years." "It has," Eleanor agreed. The combined resources of their ranches had allowed both to prosper beyond what either might have achieved alone. "I was wondering if you might consider—" He paused, suddenly less certain than the confident rancher she had come to know. "That is, I thought perhaps we might discuss extending that partnership to a more personal arrangement." Eleanor turned to study his face in the fading light. William Robertson was not Jacob Miller. He was younger, less philosophical, more deeply rooted in the practical realities of frontier life. Yet over the past 2 years, she had discovered qualities in him that resonated with her own values: honesty, determination, a willingness to consider new ideas alongside respect for proven traditions. "Are you proposing marriage, Mr. Robertson?" she asked with the directness that life on the frontier had instilled in her. "I suppose I am," he admitted with a slight smile. "Though I confess I haven't planned this moment as carefully as I perhaps should have." Eleanor considered his words thoughtfully. She had come to Wyoming to be Jacob Miller's wife, drawn by letters that promised an equal partnership rather than traditional marriage. Fate had decreed she would never meet the man whose words had brought her west, never knowing if the reality would have matched his written promises. Instead, she had forged her own path, claiming Sweetwater through determination and sacrifice. The woman who now held legal title to the ranch was not the same person who had stepped off the stagecoach 2 years earlier, her future dependent on a man she had never met. "I didn't come west seeking independence," she said finally. "I came seeking partnership with a man who valued me for my mind, as well as more traditional feminine qualities." Jacob Miller offered that in his letters, but we never had the chance to discover if those words would translate to reality. William waited, sensing she had more to say. "These past 2 years have taught me that I am capable of managing on my own, that independence is not something to fear. But they've also shown me the value of true partnership, of complementary strengths and shared purpose." She met his gaze directly. "If I were to consider marriage again, it would need to be a genuine partnership, one that builds on what I've established here rather than diminishing it." "I wouldn't want it any other way," William assured her. "What you've built at Sweetwater is remarkable. I'm proposing to join our lives, not to take over yours." Eleanor smiled, recognizing the sincerity in his words. "Then I will consider your proposal, Mr. Robertson, but I'll need some time." As twilight deepened into night, Eleanor Sutton stood on the boundary between Sweetwater Ranch and the Robertson, property, the patent document still in her hand. Before her stretched the land she had fought for and won, land that bore the marks of her labor, her decisions, her vision for the future. She had arrived in Wyoming territory as a mail-order bride, only to find her intended husband murdered and his killer unpunished. Against all expectations, including perhaps her own, she had claimed Jacob Miller's legacy as her own, transforming tragedy into triumph through sheer force of will. Now, with Sweetwater secure and prospering under her management, she faced a choice that was truly hers to make, not driven by economic necessity or social expectation, but by her own heart and mind. Whether she ultimately accepted William's proposal or continued on her independent path, the decision would be made from strength rather than vulnerability, from confidence rather than fear. As stars appeared in the vast Wyoming sky, Eleanor turned toward the house that had become her home in every sense. The light from her lanterns spilled warmly through windows onto ground that was now legally and irrefutably hers. Eleanor Sutton of Sweetwater Ranch, no longer defined by what she had lost, but by what she had created through courage, perseverance, and an unwavering belief in her own capacity to thrive on this beautiful, demanding frontier. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.